Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy. Welcome to One to One. Carrying a bundle of newspapers and shouting out the day's headlines on city streets, the newsboy is an American icon. Featured in photographs, paintings, comic strips, and public statues, he's touted as someone who is quintessentially American. But who is, or was he? Why does he loom so large in the public imagination? And is he even always a boy? Vincent DiGirolamo, Associate Professor of History at Baruch College, answers these questions in his engaging book, Crying the News, A History of Americans Newsboys. It's published by Oxford University Press. Welcome.
Thank you.
So, Professor, what made you want to write a book about newsboys?
Well, the short answer is the one that I wanted to write didn't exist. And I was driven by, inspired by a combination of personal reasons and intellectual reasons. Coming out of a labor journalist background, discovering labor history, I really wanted to pursue this question of sort of petty capitalism and the role of commerce in the sustenance of working class families. Newsboys were really the most common form of child labor and street labor in particular. And so I thought that they would be an interesting way in to the working class experience, writ small. I also happened to come from a family of newsboys with my father and my uncle, and they really helped support the family in the Depression era, as many children did for their families. So the combination of personal and intellectual reasons made me focus on this particular group.
So when did newsboys come on the scene and how prevalent were they?
Yes, I date newsboys proper having emerged in 1833 with the founding of the New York Sun by Benjamin Day. And he was really the first to recruit children on a large scale to sell on the streets this commodity for a penny, an affordable price for a working man or woman. And so 1833, this was the beginning, I see. Of course, there were news distribution beforehand in the Revolutionary period, in the colonial era. Benjamin Franklin, going back to 1720, as an apprentice, distributed his brother's newspaper in Boston. And even before him, a slave owned by the Boston postmaster distributed his newspaper, the first in the colonies. So it does really go back to the founding of America, and really transforms in the new market revolution, the 1830s and 40s.
What did a newsboy's daily job involve?
Well, a newsboy's job changed over the course of the centuries as technology changed, as cities grew. But essentially, it was to try to get the newspaper from the press to the people. And so this meant, going to the newspaper office or a distribution depot and picking up a supply, sometimes buying the supply, sometimes getting it on credit, and then trying to unload and to sell so they wouldn't get stuck and lose out in their investment. So the newsboys really, some specialized in routes and getting customers, others specialized in staking out certain corners, certain places in the city, and they would sell that way. So the challenge of a newsboy was not just to sell, but to create the market for these newspapers. So they had to shout, they had to yell, they had to feature the headlines that they thought would be most appealing, and so this is why they really contributed to the what I call the urban soundscape.
And Crying the News is the title of your book. I gather they could have been something, so they were obviously a real presence on the city streets, and probably some people felt a real nuisance.
Yes, indeed, particularly on the Sabbath, when they are shouting news of murder and scandal and secular doings, when people should be reading the Bible and quietly in their own homes. So the Sabbatarian movement, of course, was really bigger than the abolition movement in the 1840s and early 50s, and the newsboys became a real target. And this is interesting in that I really also discovered that the kids mobilized against their opposition, and that they would pass resolutions, and they would want to fine the ministers for ringing their bells on Sunday and making their own noise. So we see this kind of, I don't know, a love-hate relationship where we appreciate their service, they're helping themselves and their families, yet they are also creating problems and getting into trouble.
What was the background? Could you describe the demographics of the Newsboys? I mean, where they, Irish, German, where they come from, Black, female, poor, how old?
Right. Well, news sellers were men and women, were children as well as adults, were the disabled, were all different immigrant groups and ethnic groups. So they were really the bottom of the working class, those children who had not a lot of other options. And so we see the patterns in the various cities reflects the immigration patterns. And we have lots of Irish and Germans in the 1830s and 40s. In the 1880s, 90s, we get a lot of Eastern European Jews, Italian, Southern Europeans come in. So the demographic profile really changes. Through it all, there are African Americans who are selling papers as well. It is one area where they can enter without too much opposition, and they are present in the 1840s and 50s and throughout, and mainly in the South, but then they come into Baltimore, New York, and northern cities as well. Usually, African Americans tend to be older because it is not just a sort of interim sort of occupation, a transitional occupation, but often it becomes more either a lifelong or a longer occupation because the job options are limited.
And they were really selling papers to eat, right?
Yes, by and large, it was a subsistence trade. But I referred to the tiers of the trade. So there was real money to be made. And that there, as I say, there were middlemen who emerged, and they became the founders of big distribution companies. And so we see some people prospering as well in the trade. But by and large, it was a daily sort of subsistence kind of activity for most children.
You write that the Newsboys formed one of the first youth subcultures. Describe that subculture.
Yeah, I was surprised to find out that in pursuing this activity, they are hanging out, bonding together. There's a lot of wait time. There's a lot of downtime waiting for your newspapers, and so in so doing, you are engaging in gambling. You're playing craps. You're pitching pennies. You develop your own slang. You develop your nicknames for each other. Their own style of dress. Newsboys like to consider themselves quite dapper with their hand-me-downs and their mismatched clothes and unfitted clothes. So they had that. They were also saw themselves as quite worldly in terms of knowing how the city worked and knowing their way around town. So they became quite precocious in this subculture. And of course, they had spending money where lots of other kids didn't. And so they were avid theater goers, occupying the cheap seats, considered themselves aficionados of Blood and Thunder productions, and reading the first Penny Dreadful comics and stories as well. So as consumers, as workers, as hangers about, they had their own subculture.
They were pretty tough, gritty, and independent, weren't they?
I would think that's a fair generalization because they are hustling, and unlike academics, there's not people out there working against you, trying to ruin your career, trying to make you go broke that day. Where these children, they had competitors. I have many cases where they bonded together, they shared their money, there was a lot of cooperation as well. But by and large, there was competition and physical competition. So you had to be tough. And if you weren't that tough, you had to look tough. You had to smoke, you had to swear, you had to affect. Even girls, especially girls, were the most foul-mouthed because it was a defense mechanism when they're challenged. So the aura of being tough was as much a part of it as actually being able to defend yourself. If you couldn't defend yourself, you were worthless as a news seller.
They began to capture the attention of reformers. What was that like?
Well, as I say, their activities sort of attracted the attention of city fathers and reformers and churchmen quite early on, because some of them saw this as a answer to their poverty. Yes, give them papers to sell. We can have them sleep outside the newspaper offices. So in one era, news peddling is the solution to these problems, and in another era, it's looked at as the problem itself. So we have Charles Loyne Brace, for example, in the 1850s, founding the first children's Newsboys lodging house to try to give them shelter, make them pay their own way and they're in a self-respecting way, but also to teach them by the Bible, reading the Bible, reading scriptures, give them that kind of education, as well as showers and that as well. So we have that. We have the Catholic Church saying, wait a minute, that some of these kids are Catholic, and so Father Drumgoole, there's Drumgoole Park in Lower Manhattan. He has a counterpart, and these lodging houses are not just in New York; they're in cities across the country, and they're funded by and sponsored by sometimes the newspapers, but also Women's Christian Temperance Union and other groups. And so reformers are attracting the attention. Their attention is attracted to these children because to address the needs of the newsboys and the problems, you're addressing gambling, you're street vice, you're addressing delinquency, you're addressing illiteracy, you're addressing families torn apart by drink. So whatever your issue was as a reformer, newsboys were in cities throughout the country. You could advance your cause by focusing on these newsboys and girls.
Were the newsboys, would you say that they were exploited by newspaper publishers?
I think so. I mean, if we define exploitation as use for profit, they were used for profit. Okay, but I try to look at it in a nuanced way and show that there's really a fine line in some cases between opportunity and exploitation. And so the newspapers did rely on them, did depend on them. Sometimes they would say, oh, we don't need them, we're just doing them a favor, but they would fight and lobby. And whenever there were regulations introduced in the 1920s, 10s, 20s, 30s, they would often oppose them. So they really cherished this labor and tried to take care of it and try to ameliorate the problems and the criticism by offering, again, reading rooms and banquets and excursions and scholarships and even schools. Some newspapers in the 1880s had schools right on their property, public schools in the newspaper office, so that the kids could fulfill the obligation to go to school and still be available at the hours they needed them. So yes, they were exploited, but many saw this as an opportunity, and many did use it as a stepping stone. So I like to play with that duality and that dichotomy in their experience.
We complain a lot about fake news today, but newsboys were often peddled fake news in order to increase sales, right?
They did. I have several examples. Crying news of the bombing of Fort Sumter 2 weeks before it happened was one case. A duel. They duel shipwrecks. They would announce shipwrecks, on slow news days. Create wars in Japan, and so this was a ruse that some of them employed. Of course, during World War I, if you engaged in this kind of thing, you could be prosecuted under the Espionage Act or Sedition Act, and so it became a problem. Newspapers themselves, of course, published hoaxes and had false news as well. So in some ways, they were part of that sort of fast and loose relationship with the truth. So there is that tradition as well.
The 1920s were boom years, both for newspapers and for newsboys. Why?
Well, the 1920s, of course, was a period of prosperity for not everybody, but for a lot of people. New technology, of course, with cars, radio, and coming more popularly owned. So this was a Republican era. This was an era where modernity versus tradition clashed. And so we had all kinds of new entertainment as well with the boxing, broadcast boxing and all kinds of uh, amusements.
There were
Professional
also
sports.
a lot of really good news stories, right?
Well, there were a lot of good news stories. Of course, we have prohibition in the 1920s, and we have organized crime, and of course, newspapers were in some ways the testing ground for gangsters in Chicago and elsewhere, because these kids cut their teeth on the newspaper wars and intimidating rival newspapers and rival newsboys. And so we see that as a reality in the 1920s as well as the, in relation to that, the myth increases. All kinds of people's obituaries, and every president was a newsboy, and every millionaire was a newsboy. And so it as capitalism is celebrated during this decade, the newsboy emerges as an emblematic figure, and labor unions are crushed and are hurt in this period as well. And newsboys had been quite active as labor activists, really.
We're going to get to that, but something that you just mentioned, what was it about the newspaper boys that stoked the national imagination?
Well, I think newsboys really had a wide appeal because of what they symbolized. They were symbols of the free press, of democracy, of entrepreneurial, the spirit of capitalism. So their employer, if you will, their product that they produced was a creator of discourse, a creator of ideas about them. And so they were promoted in this way by the newspapers, by genre painters as well, by fiction writers. Horatio Alger was a latecomer to the game, but he is most famous for really romanticizing the street boy. And there is a certain amount of upward mobility that did occur, and so they became emblematic of that as well. So for these reasons, I think the children really resonated with Americans.
You mentioned that newsboys played a role in the labor movement. Because they not only sometimes struck against their own employers, but they supported striking workers in other businesses as well.
Yes, they did. So in spite of the reputation of them as little capitalists, little Wall Street brokers to be, they were squarely rooted in the working class. That they were children of teamsters and bartenders and policemen and other manual laborers. And so they were part of this culture. And so they really imbibed some of the principles. And one of those was to organize. And so they stood up for their rights, and they had indignation parades in the 1840s when a newspaper would come out too late, and they'd commit themselves to buying a certain number. The newspaper would come out late and they'd be stuck. They wouldn't be able to have enough time to sell them. So we see them organizing in these early ways. And forming unions, and really in the 1880s they affiliate with the Knights of Labor. There's the Junior Knights of Labor. There's the Kids of Labor, is formed in Boston. Later the American Federation of Labor. They get their own certificate and their own legitimate sort of membership. And then in the early 1900s, the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, the most radical labor organization, federation in the United States, and they are affiliating with them. So I see this kind of political activity. They're striking over bad cut. They want a better percentage of the newspaper. They're striking over work rules that they don't like. Somebody gets fired, someone they like, they'll strike. So there's dozens and dozens of strikes that I encountered.
I was really surprised to hear that they were willing to walk off the job and forego, their income in support of other people in other lines of work who were on strike.
Yes.
At some point, newsboys were renamed newspaper boys. By whom and why? What was that about?
Right. Well, this shows how strong the industry is, and the International Circulation Managers Association, the ICMA, was formed in the early 1900s to really uh, be a professional organization for circulation managers, but also to stave off efforts to subject these children to child labor laws, which they were exempt by and large because they weren't really employees. They just came to the office, bought their papers, and they said, "Well, we can't, if we don't want to sell to young people, they get the papers from older boys or older." And so these children were the last to be regulated. And so the newspaper industry, the International Circulation Managers Association, felt that the word newsboy connoted the ragged, dirty-faced scamp who got into trouble. And so they coined this term newspaper boy, one word, and they got a stamp issued in his honor, and were able to have an international newspaper boy day, and they were to use their public relations skills in order to kind of sanitize this image and this character and make them busy boys, better boys. That was the motto in the 1950s, actually.
What factors led to the decline of newsboys?
Well, everything's connected to everything else. And so we see really after the 1930s and the 40s, there is more reliance on newsstands, on radio. And so the newsboy proper, school attendance becomes much more common. Suburbanization erodes the prototypical urban newsboy, city newsboy. So these are some of the factors, as well as we get up to the 1960s and 70s, the route boy, the carrier, is still going strong, but we have a rash of kidnappings. We have the rise of fast foods, and children, young people have other job opportunities. And the newspapers themselves are dwindling because of internet competition and other factors. And so newspapers sometimes just get rid of their youth core, and they're really not as efficient as adults with cars. And so we see that's really the method of distribution today. Still immigrants, often still people, retirees, veterans, people who need to make money, who work in several jobs. They're still not employees. They're still independent contractors, but they're providing this service today.
But the news crying pretty much disappeared altogether, right?
Yes, I mean, we don't hear too many, even when we see people on the corner selling papers. And so they were subjected to the antinoise laws. It was seen as a physical hazard, a health hazard like air pollution or anything else. And so there was a clampdown on noise of various types. And so there was a real diminution, I think. In the 30s, still headlines, probably in the 40s as well. But after that, we don't hear too many cries on the street.
What do we learn by studying the history of newsboys?
Well, I think we learn a lot. We learn about social change. We learn about generational change, and how these children, these working class children, were not just sort of exploited, but that they were part of the social scene, part of the political scene. We see how young people acquire their political sensibilities, their sense of class consciousness. All these things begin early, not just when you're grown up, out of school, entering the workforce. And so we see that process of social change early on. I think we see that the newspaper as an institution of an employing institution that is really, I think, one of the most important children's oriented institutions in the country. We think of public schools and Little League and Boy Scouts and what have you, but the newspapers for working class kids, they were quite integral to their life. So I think we see that. I think also we see how culture works. This may be too big or too ambitious, but we see how the same social activity, selling papers, can be deemed virtuous and ennobling in one period, and then as corrupting and terrible in another period. So why is that? How is this activity being framed in the press, in art, in literature? And we see that through these children, through their different kinds of representations, we see how meaning changes over time.
Well, you certainly give us a look at a segment of the workforce that had not been explored very much. We know about the garment workers and the people in the tenements downtown, a different segment that I think had not been examined a lot.
Well, thank you. I did have predecessors. I was inspired by Herb Gutman at the CUNY Graduate Center back in the 1980s, doing history of the underclass, doing history from the bottom up. David Nassau, of course, wrote a good book, Children of the Cities, which had a chapter on Newsboys and looked at these kids in a particular time in the turn of the century. But I wanted to have a longer expansive time and really show their relationship to the industry as well as to each other and their families and the culture at large and the historical events that they are shouting, that they are selling news of, but they're being influenced by them as well. So that's the kind of world that I wanted to uncover through this book.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to thank Vincent DiGirolamo, professor of history at Baruch College, for joining me today. To learn about our upcoming shows, you should follow us on Twitter at 1-to-1 CUNY TV. For the City University of New York and 1-to-1, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.